Today I have something really special for you. I had the chance to sit down with Rich Vreeland, also known as Disasterpeace, the composer behind some of the coolest soundtracks of the last decade, including games like Fez, Hyper Light Drifter, and shows like Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, and even an award-winning score for It Follows. Rich has a masterful and intuitive approach to composing, blending world design, musical storytelling, and a compositional style that sets his work apart. In this video, I'm going to share the key moments from that conversation, the insights and creative philosophies that have helped shape his work, and break down exactly what makes his process so effective. You'll hear directly from Rich himself, and I'll jump in to give you more context and connect the dots so that you can apply these ideas to your own music. All right, so here's the plan. First, you'll hear Disasterpeace drop some knowledge bombs. Then I'll chime in and give you some more context about why this matters. And finally, I'll give you some practical steps so you can apply it. Okay, so by the end, you'll have a fresh perspective on composition and some actionable techniques that you can start using today to elevate your music. If you want to hear the full conversation, I'll link it in the description. But for now, let's dive in. When I sat down with Disasterpeace, well, first of all, I tried to not fanboy too hard because I really love his music, but I was blown away by how much his creative process reflects the same principles that I use in my own process. And he shared some incredible insights on how he approaches composing music. And turns out that a lot of his process reflects the universal principles that many great artists use in their creative work. These core creative truths are what I found to be most effective to help music creators that I work with to finish amazing sounding music that they love. So let's break down the key insights that he shared and how you can apply them directly to your own creative process. I would love to know, like, how have you kind of gotten to the place to develop this intuition with how you compose music and how you approach the art and craft?
I think that development of intuition is just something that comes from a mindset, I guess, going into writing something where I have some kind of goal or goals that I'm trying to attain, and I'm just sort of scratching towards it, making lots of little decisions to try to get there and iterating, and not being afraid to make mistakes or go down the wrong path. But just sort of having this feedback loop mechanism of, is this decision I'm making getting me closer to where I'm trying to get to or further away? And so, after developing this kind of a way of working, it becomes kind of a muscle where over time the muscle gets stronger and the confidence gets stronger. But I will say that I think even in the beginning, there were definitely times where I wasn't happy with what I was doing. And I did have to learn how to wrestle with that. Wrestle with the feeling that you're knee deep in some piece of music or something that you don't think is any good. You're like, well, what do I do now? You're like, I've sunk all this time into this thing. And, it took me time to figure out how you deal with that kind of situation.
The first thing Disasterpeace mentioned is the importance of having a clear goal when you're writing music. Think about it. The creative process is essentially a long string of decisions from your first idea all the way to a finished product. You're constantly making creative decisions. And when you don't have a clear vision, it's easy to get lost. You start questioning every choice. Does this fit? Is this the right sound? Should I scrap it and start over? That's why establishing a vision up front is so powerful. Your goal becomes a feedback mechanism. It tells you whether you're getting closer or farther away from the sound that you're aiming for. Disasterpeace talked about how over time, this strengthens your intuition muscle. You start to trust yourself more and you make better creative choices naturally. Without this sort of intuition, you'll stay stuck in uncertainty, overthinking, and second-guessing everything. So here's an action step. At the start of a project, take time to define what you're aiming for. What style are you writing in? What mood are you trying to convey? What story are you trying to tell? This will be one decision that makes every creative choice easier. But having a clear goal is only part of the equation. What happens if you get stuck in the process of getting there?
You just keep trying stuff, or you take a break. If you can, you take a break and you come back to it, listen to it with fresh ears, and new things come up. And that's another thing that's become a big part of my process, is a critical listening phase, where I try to take music to a certain point. I give myself a target. Like, there's sort of the first pass of something. I'll work on something for a bit and then I'll bounce it out render it, and then I will try to create some space from it, and then I'll just listen to it. A lot of times I listen to it in the car these days. I'll have ideas, like listening back to it, like things will stick out to me. Like I wish the piece kept going at this stage, or this section needs something, like this section's kind of boring, or maybe there's like a sound issue. I'll just take notes, listen to it and take notes. I've gotten to a point where I can listen to it one time and I might have 8 or 10 notes. Those are actionable things that I can go back and do. So now I have structure. I give myself a structure of like how to approach working on this piece of music and making it better. And so then I just go through it like a to-do list, like, okay, I'm gonna look at this section, I'm gonna look at that section. And definitely works for, I guess, the later stage of making something, because there's still the preliminary stage where I need to make something substantial enough that I could like actually render right. Want to listen back to it.
Something to work with, yeah. One of the biggest challenges of creating music is navigating your inner creator and inner critic. Disasterpeace talked about the importance of listening with fresh ears. He'll step away from a project, listen to it outside the studio, usually in the car, he said, and take some notes on actionable things to improve. Usually people get stuck simply because they're too close to the work and they get lost in the sauce. You need to take a step back and give yourself the space to see the whole picture. That's exactly what working in stages allows you to do. When you separate the creative process into focus stages like writing, composing, and editing, you stop trying to create and critique at the same time, okay? And it can be super helpful to separate the time when you're creating and the time when you're critiquing and editing when you're working on a music project. But if you skip this, you'll get stuck in a cycle of perfectionism, tweaking endlessly without making real progress. So here's an action step. After a writing session, give yourself some distance before evaluating it. When you come back to it with fresh ears, listen to it outside the studio and focus on listing out actionable improvements. This will effectively separate the time when you are focused on creating and the time when you are focused on critiquing and editing. And when you come back to the studio with an actionable list of to-dos that you can go through when you're doing a session, it will be a game changer for your ability to make massive improvements. But what happens when you hit a creative block, when nothing seems to work and you feel like what you're making isn't good enough?
It's basically like a critic, right? I've created like a custom critic for this project, right? That like has certain tastes, certain intentions and things. And then I can do stuff and I throw it at the critic and be like, am I going in the right direction or am I moving away from it? It becomes sort of like a North Star for like everything that I'm doing. And sometimes that North Star is very strong and it doesn't take a lot to get there. Other times it takes a lot more to figure out what that North Star is. It might take a lot of trial and error, like on the page, writing stuff, or sometimes I spend time at the piano trying to figure it out. I'll improvise and try to sketch out chord progressions and little melodies and things, which I may not ever use, but they're part of my creative process for figuring out what the tonality of something is. Or if a project is more focused on sound design, some styles of music are more sound design oriented than, the harmony is going to matter less. Then I might do more of that in the DAW, sound gathering kind of stuff.
This is where Disasterpeace's approach to experimenting without pressure is so key. He'll create more music than he needs, embracing trial and error as part of the process. He even mentioned how he focuses on staying curious instead of overly precious in the earlier stages of ideation. This is exactly what flow is all about, getting into a playful, experimental mindset. You're not trying to make the perfect sound, you're exploring sounds, rhythms, and ideas to see what sticks out to you. But if you put the pressure on yourself to get it right immediately, you'll choke out your creative flow before it even begins. You'll hesitate, overthink, and edit your ideas before they've had a chance to breathe. So as an action step, let yourself create without attachment. Work in shorter sessions and don't be afraid to make things that don't work. The goal is to continue to engage with the creative act in a way that allows you to continue to discover what resonates through the process. But once you've explored a lot of ideas, how do you know which ones are worth developing?
When I was younger and had the time, I would obsess more over this work that I was making, and I would spend too much time trying to improve it in a row, like chronologically. I would sit in front of my computer for way too many hours trying to improve something when there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't do it. And I found that actually part of it was out of necessity. I have a family now and other responsibilities, and I can't sit in front of my computer for 12 hours straight. It's very rare that I do that anymore, unless it's absolutely, I just no other choice. So, I have developed a habit of getting in and getting out and just really trying to be laser focused on what I'm doing. And the science supports that. As far as what we're capable of doing effectively, most people can't concentrate deeply for more than 90 minutes at a time. So after that point, you should be getting up and taking a break. And most people can't do more than 2 or 3 of those 90-minute increments a day. So right off the bat, you're talking about a very common approach of working on stuff being kind of in the sense of working on something for 12 hours or whatever. You're spending quite a lot of your time just spinning your tires. And it might feel like you're making progress, but there's a good chance that you're not working as efficiently as you could be, and you're probably more prone to second guessing yourself. Your ears are not as fresh. There's just a lot of reasons why it's counterproductive. You could probably be more productive spending less time doing it, with some exceptions. In the beginning, it's important to not be overly precious about what you're doing and to be curious. You're just kind of exploring, throwing stuff and seeing what sticks. And part of that intuition is develop ability to tell when something you're making has the potential to be good. Mm-hmm. Just because it's not good now doesn't mean it couldn't be good. And so it's kind of like cooking, are these the good ingredients? Are these gonna make something interesting down the line?
Disasterpeace emphasized the importance of working in broad strokes first, getting a rough idea down before getting caught up in the details. I often say, simply make something to have an opinion about later. This removes the pressure and encourages you to focus on what's most important for the piece to be impactful. What's the essence? What could be the main thing? Where does the music want to go? Which is the idea of finding the sculpture in the stone. This removes the pressure of having to make the sculpture. You just have to go find it. You have to go discover it through the marble. And that's why reducing the pressure to just create something in bigger brushstrokes to get a big picture to then chisel away at later is so effective. So as an action step, experiment and push your initial ideas further to see where they could go and think in broad strokes. Again, don't be precious, be curious. And once you have enough of a rough foundation, you can start to structure and refine it later. And again, if you remove the pressure of having to create anything in particular, of having to have an end result by the end of your session, and you just focus on playful experimentation and discovery, you'll notice that a lot of your ideas naturally develop themselves, and you'll get more ingredients to arm yourself with when you get to making a rough composition. But how do you decide what's actually worth pushing past the finish line and what aligns with your sound as an artist?
I think that I've always taken kind of a collector's approach to this kind of stuff. From the time I was pretty young and just getting into making music, my teenage years, I think had an ability to identify elements, things, little tidbits of musical information that stood out to me in some way. I want to know what that is. What is that? What are they doing right there? Why does that sound the way it sounds? What makes that so cool? And having done that now for 20 years, built kind of a toolkit of all these things, these kind of ideas. Sometimes I stumble onto them myself. The tritone substitution chord with the sharp 9 is just something that I stumbled onto, and I was like, oh yeah, I like that. That's cool. I was calling it the Disasterpeace 2/5.
Love it.
Not that I invented, sub 5 chords or anything. But yeah, I think when I look at those things and I take a step back, I think about them from my own kind of academic way of cataloging everything that I do. I don't spend any energy on cataloging emotional content. I think I just kind of let the emotions do what the emotions do, instead of trying to come up with a taxonomy for that. This conveys a particular sense of suspense or emotion. I think I've been more likely to just say, oh, that's cool.
Right. Yeah.
I just have a giant bag of cool stuff, and then I'll let my emotions, my instincts, and how it makes me feel sift through all that stuff and figure out what's the right thing to use here. Because, you know, obviously there are cool things that it's like, oh, like metric modulations are cool, but that doesn't mean you should use them every time you're trying to accomplish something.
One of the deeper insights Disasterpeace shared is about how you can develop your own taste. He talked about being a collector of cool stuff, noticing what sounds interesting to him, figuring out what makes it work, and then adding those ideas and techniques to his creative toolkit. And over 20 plus years, he's accumulated a vast array of tools and techniques and approaches that have become intuitive for him, right? And then he said that he lets his intuition filter through his tools and techniques based on what he's feeling. And in my opinion, that's part of the reason why his music sounds so undeniably like him, is because he filters all of these techniques and strategies and the knowledge that he's accumulated through his intuition. And that intuition is a direct link to you as an artist, to your creativity, to your taste, to your soul as a creative being, all that great stuff. And chances are you already accumulate things like this naturally, but it can be helpful to be intentional about it. So over time, this becomes your artistic signature. But if you're not paying attention to what excites you, you'll end up doing the same thing you usually do and risk getting lost in the noise. So as an action step, think about what excites you right now with the music you're listening to. Identify something, break it down, and try incorporating similar techniques into your own work. It could be a cool type of sound, a style of chord progression, or even a compositional move. And over time, this will become part of your creative DNA. But developing your taste isn't just about what you create, it's also about how you create. The way you approach your creative process can have a surprising impact on the music you make.
I think with any tools that you use, they're going to inform the path that you go down and create a structure for you as far as what your output is. If you use Logic Pro, that's going to have an impact on how you make music. If you use Ableton, that's going to have a different impact on how you make music. So the tools, it's a paradox because the tools don't matter, but they also matter a lot. Because you could use anything and make something, but depending on what you use, it's going to come out different. I guess what I'll say is there have been times where I knew I had to create like a through composed piece of music. Like the example that I think of is there's this cue in Under the Silver Lake, which is like 5 minutes long, and it's all under dialogue. And for those of you who are not familiar with the film, it's like a film noir, and the score is orchestral, mid-century style with some electronic elements, very much inspired by Bernard Herrmann. So it's a lot of chromatic voice leading and weird, it's kind of the stuff you're talking about, like a lot of exotic chords. When I think about my tendency, if I'm just gonna sit down and try to make something in one fell swoop, it's gonna be simple because I don't have the mental capacity to write a John Williams overture suite or something. It's especially not to kind of like wing it. So when I know that I have to write 5 minutes of music, it has to be interesting, it has to have all these sections and moments that are under dialogue, which is for mid-century, that style. It's a lot of these like curious kind of passages, like quizzical, that's just kind of going places without drawing too much attention. So knowing that, one technique that I've developed over the years is to completely separate production and composition. Kind of, just kind of treat it. In some ways, it's kind of like hearkening back maybe to, how composition was always done, which was just on an instrument. So I would I'd sit down and start playing stuff and doing some voice leading, editing voice leading and stuff with like a electric piano instrument. And I would just write something for the entire scene, like 5 minutes of electric piano that goes in different places. Just create some sort of like structure that sounds interesting. And when you are only focusing on composition, it's freeing because you don't have to, I'm not even thinking about arrangement yet. Like I'm just thinking about how can I make this instrument, which is clearly not the right instrument for this scene, how can I make it sound as good as possible So, I mean, I guess maybe it's not fair to say that I'm not thinking about it, orchestration at all. I am thinking about it a little bit. I'm thinking about different lines that are moving, and I'm going to put those on brass and woodwinds and stuff like that. But just having that freedom to not be worrying about production decisions and instrumentation decisions allows me to write in a very different style than I would if, I'm loading up a break, and I'm just like, I'm loading up a break and I'm just going to play some bass over it. Like, that's going to send me in a very different direction than sitting down and just literally composing with one instrument an entire piece of music and then putting all the orchestration into it. So that's just one example, because it's really hard to get deep into production early and then having not finished composing like the piece. To try to do those at the same time is really hard, and you're gonna have to cut corners somewhere. There have been times where I've done pieces like that, but I was using like a handful of it was very few instruments. Then I would circle back around and flesh it out, because you have to come to terms with the limitations we all have. We can only do so much in the moment, and we find ways to get around that. The asynchronous ability of working on this stuff, you can circle back around and add more stuff and make it more impressive than it was the first time.
So finally, Disasterpeace talked about how working with a prompt, whether it is a game, a soundtrack, or a creative constraint, gives his music structure and purpose. When he was working on Hyper Light Drifter, he created 8 to 9 versions of the same piece based on a clear creative limitation. In our full interview, he went into the process of how, like, in a certain level of the game, there was a certain backstory for that area of the game where there was certain musical cues where it was like these frozen warriors that got frozen in crystals in time, and there was like hints of a war or something of that nature. And he used all of those cues as creative limitations to help him write pieces of music that fit with that scene. So again, having a very specific musical goal creates the container for your creative decisions. Ironically, limitations give you freedom. They narrow the possibilities in a very useful way so that you can work with more purposeful focus and clarity, okay? So within those limitations, you'll have way more creative freedom to explore those limitations instead of exploring anything and everything under the sun. This simple prompt can help guide your instrument choices, the scales you use, time signature, and when to introduce tension and resolution.
What's really interesting about the writing style for this game is that everything is written in these like there's a very like clear structure to everything.
Okay.
Because I basically wrote pieces of music that were like 90 seconds to 2 minutes long. Just loops.
Right.
But then I would write like, 8 or 9 versions of the same thing.
Interesting.
So I would basically, for a piece like this, I probably was like this first bit, or like maybe in here. This is probably the first one that I wrote, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm creating like a structure that has it has a rigidity to it,
right?
And then I'm gonna make variations of this piece, like where it gets a little bit more intense, less intense. There's a version with no percussion where I keep the same time, but it feels a lot more rubato because it's just pads, and I can flub the timing a little bit and get away with it because the music system in this game, like all these layers, it's basically crossfading between them. It's picking. Depending on context, it's gonna, we're gonna have the part that's like mostly just percussion, or then we're gonna bring in the more instruments when you start to like fight more of these warrior guys. Once you get through that whole section, you're in the sort of like the palette cleanse, the quiet before the storm.
Right.
When you're about to go fight the last general, that's sort of the ending of that piece where it's like, it's much more ambient. It still has the same structure, like roughly speaking. It's roughly the same chords with some changes to make it more interesting, and added a melody to make it a little bit different.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. Like the multiple versions being part of how that game processes the audio and delivers it. And like you created all these different versions. Like, yeah, that'd be an interesting experiment. Like, I almost might try that. Only the
Actually
pad version.
makes really interesting songs. The soundtrack is just me stitching those together, figuring
Right.
out how to stitch them together into like a piece of music. That implementation, it was set of limitations that really allowed me to lean deeply into that, and it helped me make some really cool stuff that I wouldn't have made otherwise. Just having that boundary of like,
Yeah.
all I have to do is like make a 2 minute piece of music. Once I do that, I'm good, because then I just duplicate it and I start messing with it and make different versions. I had something in mind, like, okay, maybe this will be the version. This will be the version of this when this is happening, and this will be
Right.
then I have to create a variation for when you're resting or whatnot.
Disasterpeace also talked about how the tools you use shape the music you create. Simply put, if you change the process, you change the results. That's why being intentional about your tools is so important. The DAW you use, the instruments you pick, and even the order you work in will shape the outcome. And depending on the vision you have or the needs of the project, you can intentionally select what tools you will use to influence the result you will get. He also mentioned the value of separating composition and production, which ties into this idea of divergent versus convergent thinking. He gave an example of when he had a prompt of writing a score for a 5 minute piece of music. What he focused on was getting a piano sound and writing a 5 minute piece of music that moves to different places. That was his focus. He wasn't focused on the arrangement. He wasn't focused on the production, or if even his piano sound was what he was going to use in the final production. But he narrowed the scope of his focus by using one specific tool, which is the piano, and his intention, which was to write a 5 minute piece. He wasn't writing a loop. He wasn't an Ableton in session view. He wasn't like trying to write all the instruments together. He was like, I just need a flowy piece of music on piano that I can build from. Okay. And if we try to mix our divergent thinking, which is brainstorming, exploration, seeing what can happen, right? And convergent thinking, which is very goal focused, right? Problem solving, refining, and editing, it can just be a headache, right? So if you try to compose, arrange, and produce at the same time, you're creating a ton of friction. Separating them gives you way more creative freedom. So as an action step for this, pick the tools that will influence the process to align with the type of music that you want to make. Now we have all of the pieces, but how do we actually put them all together to finish more music like Disasterpeace? Like if you look at his catalog, he's insanely prolific and he has so much good music out there. How do we come even close to this level of being prolific? What's so powerful about this is that Disasterpeace isn't just a talented composer. He's developed a creative process that reflects deep artistic and creative principles. This is why he is so prolific, why his music is remarkable and is so undeniably his. If you want to discover your own creative process by leveraging these same insights and principles to finish more music that you're proud of, definitely check out this video next where I go over an entire system designed to give you the tools, structure, and focus to finish more music while staying in creative flow. So I'll see you in that video.